There is something about hospitals that has always carried a strange weight. Even the most modern and well-lit ones, with well-kept corridors and health professionals constantly moving around, cannot escape a peculiar feeling that seems to hang in the air. Perhaps it is the nature of what happens there. Births, cures, but also pain, suffering and death. It is as if the walls of these places absorb the emotions of everyone who passes through them, leaving invisible traces. But in some hospitals, these traces seem to take on a life of their own. Imagine walking into an abandoned hospital, where the echoes of ancient footsteps still echo in the empty corridors. The lights flicker, and for a brief moment, you have the feeling that you are not alone. A distant whisper, a figure that disappears around the next bend. This is not just a scene from a horror movie. For many people, it is a real experience. In the United States, there are hospitals with reputations that go beyond the limits of rationality. Places where the inexplicable is not an exception, but rather part of the routine, even years after they have been deactivated. Today, you'll learn stories that go beyond urban legends. We'll delve into accounts from doctors, nurses, patients, and paranormal investigators who swear they've witnessed activity that defies any logical explanation. These hospitals aren't just haunting scenes. They're silent witnesses to events that remain shrouded in mystery. What if I told you that some of these hauntings have been documented? That security cameras have captured unexplained movements and that voices have been recorded even when the hospital was empty? Throughout this video, you'll hear details from real investigations, testimonies, and records that will give you goosebumps. And maybe you'll start to look at that empty hallway differently the next time you visit a hospital at night. Some of these cases are so intense that even skeptics can't ignore them. In hospitals like Waverly Hills Sanatorium, there are stories of patients who never left the place, even decades after their deaths. The sound of gurneys moving by themselves, doors closing without explanation, and shadows appearing in photographs are just the beginning. Get ready, because the stories you're about to hear may change the way you view these places. After watching this video, you might think twice about walking alone into an abandoned hospital. Let's start with one of the most haunted hospitals in the United States, where reports of paranormal activity began in the 1920s and continue to this day. At the top of the list of most haunted hospitals in the United States is the Waverly Hills Sanatorium, located in Louisville, Kentucky. Originally built in the early 20th century to treat tuberculosis patients, the hospital quickly became the scene of countless tragedies. At the time, tuberculosis had no definitive cure, and medical practices were rudimentary, often invasive and painful. It is estimated that thousands of patients died within its walls, and many believe that some of those souls never left. As you approach the building, it is hard not to feel a chill run down your spine. The massive dark brick structure seems to defy time, with windows that reflect the light of the sunset in an eerie way. The trees that surround the sanatorium bend over it as if trying to hide the building from the outside world. The silence that surrounds the place, even during the day, is heavy. Reports of hauntings in Waverly Hills are not new. Former employees claim that, during its period of operation, there were stories of hallways where footsteps could be heard, even when no one was there. One of the most famous areas is the Tunnel of Death, an underground corridor originally used to transport the bodies of deceased patients to the outside of the hospital, away from the eyes of other patients. The tunnel has become one of the most paranormally active locations, with reports of whispers and even apparitions of shadowy figures that seem to follow unsuspecting visitors. One of the most unsettling stories involves room 502. It is believed that a nurse, in the throes of despair, committed suicide there in the 1930s. Visitors report feeling an oppressive presence as they approach the room, and many claim to have seen the figure of a woman dressed in white silently watching from the end of the hallway. On some nights, the sound of soft sobbing echoes through the floor. In addition, there are reports of shadows moving across the walls, following people as they walk through the building. Some witnesses describe the sensation of invisible hands touching their shoulders or tugging at their clothes. In 2001, a group of paranormal investigators spent a night in Waverly Hills. During the investigation, they captured strange audio, including voices whispering their names and unexplained knocking. In one of the videos recorded in room 502, a human-shaped shadow was recorded crossing the hallway and then disappearing shortly thereafter. While many have tried to explain the events as the result of the charged environment and psychological suggestion, the evidence gathered over the years raises questions that even skeptics cannot fully dispel. Waverly Hills is just the beginning of our journey. As we move forward, other hospitals, similarly marked by suffering and tragedy, reveal even more disturbing stories. To understand the true extent of the hauntings that surround hospitals like Waverly Hills, it is necessary to hear directly from those who have experienced them firsthand. Doctors, nurses, and patients share stories that have often been kept quiet for years, not because they are unwilling to tell, but because they fear not being taken seriously. Julia Bennett, a former nurse who worked in a California psychiatric hospital during the 1980s, vividly recalls a night that changed her perception forever. At the time, Julia was working night shifts, walking the hallways of the third floor, a ward that had been rumored to have been the scene of suicides and unexplained patient deaths over the decades. One quiet night, while making routine rounds, Julia heard the distinct sound of someone shuffling across the polished floor. At first, she thought it was a patient who had left his room without permission. When she turned the corner, she saw a figure with its back turned, wearing a hospital gown, standing in front of one of the windows. "Sir, you need to go back to your room," Julia said, approaching cautiously. The figure didn't move. Julia kept walking until, just a few feet away, the man disappeared before her eyes. There was no sound, no shadow, no sign of anyone else. The hallway was once again completely silent. That wasn't the only story. Other staff members reported seeing figures on security cameras, but when they sent guards to check, they found nothing. A receptionist who worked in the emergency room reported feeling a cold hand touch her shoulder repeatedly during a busy shift, only to realize she was alone in the room. Among patients, the stories are even more intense. Robert Sanders, a long-term patient at a Texas rehabilitation hospital, described seeing an elderly woman sitting at the foot of his bed for several nights in a row. She said nothing, just stared at him, her gaze lost. When Robert asked the staff about the woman, they were puzzled, since there were no patients like her on the ward. Some cases of hauntings seem to follow patterns. A curious example involves the experience of several nurses who, in different states of the country, report seeing the same figure. A woman in a blue dress, always seen near the operating rooms. Some believe that this figure may be the spirit of a nurse who died in an accident during an operation in the 1940s. Another intriguing point is the frequency with which patients report feeling presences in their rooms moments before they die. Family members who spent nights in hospitals claim to have heard voices whispering names or felt a heavy atmosphere shortly before losing their loved ones. These reports are not isolated. In practically every state in the U.S., there are hospitals with similar stories, reinforcing the idea that pain and death can leave permanent impressions in these places. Hospital corridors, at night, seem to transform. Artificial lighting creates shadows that dance across the walls, and the absolute silence amplifies even the most subtle sounds. Maintenance workers, who often work lonely shifts, also have their stories to tell. Mick Davis, an electrician responsible for a series of repairs at an abandoned hospital in Pennsylvania, says that while working alone in the basement, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. When he turned around, he saw no one, but the sound continued, as if someone were moving around the place. Mick left the job unfinished that night and refused to return alone. These stories, taken together, paint a terrifying picture of what happens when the lights go out in hospitals. But beyond the verbal accounts, There is concrete evidence, videos, audios, and photographs that document the unexplained. And that is exactly what we will explore next. Over the past few decades, growing interest in paranormal phenomena has led investigators to explore abandoned hospitals across the United States. Television shows, documentaries, and independent groups have spent entire nights at locations known for their macabre history, armed with infrared cameras, audio recorders, and motion sensors. What these investigations have uncovered goes beyond coincidence or simple suggestions from the mind. One of the most documented cases occurred at Penhurst State School and Hospital in Pennsylvania. Abandoned since the 1980s, Penhurst is a dark complex with hallways lined with rusty gurneys and rooms where time seems to have stood still. During one investigation, a group picked up a series of children's voices whispering through the recorder, even though there was no one nearby. In one video, a heavy door closes by itself, without any apparent draft. Another location that has attracted the attention of investigators is St. Augustine Hospital in Florida. Known for its history of fires and unexplained deaths, the hospital was the scene of a recording showing a translucent figure walking down a hallway before disappearing into one of the rooms. When the team checked the premises, they found no one there, but the video captured it clearly. This visual evidence is often accompanied by disturbing audio. One famous example occurred during the investigation of Linda Vista Hospital in Los Angeles. Closed in 1991, the hospital is known for its reputation as being haunted by former patients. In one of the recordings, a faint, hoarse voice whispers, "Go away," in direct response to a question from the investigator. The clarity of the audio surprised even the most skeptical team members. Thermal cameras have also revealed unexplained silhouettes in places where, theoretically, there should be no presence. In one of the recordings made at Rolling Hills Asylum, a humanoid form was detected walking across an empty room. Upon inspecting the premises, investigators found no sign of physical intrusion. An interesting pattern emerges from these investigations. Most of the evidence comes from places that have been the scene of great suffering. Many investigators hypothesize that intense emotions, fear, pain, and anguish, can leave an energetic imprint, resulting in paranormal activity. But not all of the evidence is captured by sophisticated equipment. Visitors report experiencing sudden changes in temperature, unexplained odors, and a sense of being watched. On some occasions, objects have been seen moving on their own, such as chairs sliding inches or doors slowly opening for no apparent reason. One of the most disturbing stories involves a group of cameramen who were filming a documentary at a decommissioned psychiatric hospital in Michigan. When they reviewed the footage, they noticed that in one scene, a pale figure appeared to be watching the staff from a second-floor window. The problem? At the time, all of the staff members were gathered on the ground floor. These investigations raise an important question. What really happens in these hospitals after they close? The evidence suggests that in many cases, the story of the hospital does not end with its closure. The energies that remain there seem to be lurking, manifesting themselves to those brave enough to explore its dark corridors. But as compelling as the evidence may be, one question remains. Are we dealing with real spirits or projections of the human mind, influenced by charged environments? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. With each new investigation, more questions arise, keeping alive the fascination and fear that these hospitals inspire. To truly understand the phenomena that occur in haunted hospitals, it is essential to go back in time and explore the histories that these places hold. Hospitals are not only places of healing. Many have also been scenes of suffering, neglect, and death, creating an environment that, according to some theories, can be prone to the emergence of paranormal manifestations. In this chapter, we will delve into the dark history behind some of these hauntings, examining how a hospital's past can be a key to understanding unexplained events in the present. The dark past of Penhurst State School and Hospital. One of the most iconic examples of a hospital with a history marked by tragedy is the Penhurst State School and Hospital in Pennsylvania. Opened in 1908, the facility was initially designed as a center for the mentally disabled, but over the decades, the hospital became infamous for its cruel and inhumane approach to patients. Living conditions were extremely poor. Patients were often kept in cages or tied to beds, and treatments, when they did exist, were brutally invasive. The inhumane practices at Penhurst were largely ignored until a television report in 1968 exposed the deplorable conditions at the facility. From then on, scandals involving abuse and neglect began to escalate until the hospital was finally closed in 1987. What followed, as one might expect, are reports of hauntings at the facility. Staff and visitors report the sounds of screams and cries coming from the old wards. Those who have dared to explore the facility claim that they feel constantly watched, as if the suffering of the patients is still embedded in the walls. The history of abuse, accumulated pain, and premature deaths of so many of the facility's inhabitants seem to have left an indelible mark, creating an environment ripe for spirits trapped in suffering to attempt to communicate with the living. The mystery of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Another place with an equally disturbing past is the Waverly Hills Sanatorium, located in Louisville, Kentucky. Originally opened as a hospital to treat tuberculosis patients in the 1920s, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium was a place of isolation where patients were kept away from their families at a time when the disease was incurable and highly contagious. During its years of operation, the sanatorium became known for its high mortality rate, and many patients died without receiving proper care or dignity. With the advancement of medical treatments, the sanatorium was closed in 1961, but the history of suffering and death left a lasting impression. Reports from employees and visitors suggest that the Waverly Hills Sanatorium is one of the most haunted places in the country. Many claim to hear footsteps in the empty hallways, unexplained whispers, and the sound of doors creaking, even though no one is around. One of the most disturbing reports from Waverly Hills is the so-called Shadow Man. Several people who have visited the site claim to have seen a shadowy, human-like but faceless figure watching them from a distance. When they try to get closer, the figure disappears. The history of Waverly Hills seems to be intertwined with the lost souls of the patients who have passed through there, whose pain and despair may have created a kind of energetic residue, making the place a focal point for paranormal activity. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The Psychological Darkness. The story of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia is another one that cannot be ignored when it comes to haunted hospitals. Founded in 1858, this asylum was originally intended to treat people with mental illnesses. However, as the institution grew, the hospital began to have more patients than it could handle, which led to deplorable living conditions and extremely cruel treatments. Many patients were kept in overcrowded cells, without access to adequate care. The number of deaths on the hospital grounds was alarming, and the psychological trauma of the people who lived and died that was etched into the walls of the place. As a result, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum became famous not only for its history of neglect and suffering, but also for reports of paranormal activity. Many report hearing screams and the sounds of chains dragging on the floor. There are also stories of objects moving on their own and visions of human figures that, when approached, instantly disappear. The atmosphere of the place is oppressive, and many who work or visit the hospital report feeling a constant sense of anguish, as if they are being watched. The connection between suffering and paranormal manifestations. The dark history behind these haunted hospitals suggests a connection between intense suffering and the manifestation of spirits or paranormal phenomena. According to some spiritual theories, places where pain, fear, and death are common tend to trap souls, creating a residual energy that can be felt by those still living there. The idea that emotional energy leaves an indelible impression on the environment is a central concept in many spiritual traditions and theories of the supernatural. Experts in paranormal phenomena suggest that these places act almost like magnets for spiritual manifestations. because pain and suffering create a kind of energy field that attracts spirits. Some theorists claim that in places like the aforementioned hospitals, the spirits of deceased patients may remain trapped due to the trauma they experienced while alive. As a result, the places become a kind of vibrational field in which communication between the world of the living and the dead is easier. What makes haunted hospitals even more fascinating is the sense that these stories, and the experiences they involve, transcend time. Each place has its own scars, its own tragedies, and they all accumulate on the walls, in the air, in the hallways and rooms of these hospitals. These are not just spirits wandering around, but souls that seem to still be trapped in their own narratives, who, even after death, cannot find peace. As we explore these places and hear the stories of those who have visited or worked there, the question arises: is the dark history behind each hospital really alive within its walls, or is it our imagination that, fueled by the tragedies of the past, transforms these places into a gateway to the unknown?